Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our reading of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And I have to tell you, since that last chapter, I have been watching the mailbox, eagerly waiting for a response to the letter we sent last time, because Elizabeth Bennet is dealing with the mortification of her sister, Lydia, home to Longbourn with her new husband, the odious Mr. Wickham, having been saved just narrowly from plunging themselves and the whole family into disgrace by being bought off at the altar, essentially. And you would expect, I guess the family expected, that Lydia would show some awareness of that, some contrition. And instead, her visit to Longbourn has been a nightmare of cluelessness, where she's as happy and as proud and as preening as could be over something that should make her ashamed for the rest of her life. And that, if that's bad enough, but Elizabeth Bennet is learning to deal with that when, at one point, when Lydia is burbling on about her wedding, she mentions that Mr. Darcy was present for the sacred occasion, which bowls Elizabeth. What on earth? Why was Mr. Darcy? How is he even involved in this at all? He's at Pemberley. And she dashes off a letter to her aunt, who would know all about it, asking if there's anything that you can tell me within the bounds of secrecy, please do so immediately. And I've been waiting, just waiting. And now we are at chapter 52 when we get our response, a nice long response. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of receiving an answer to her letter as soon as she possibly could. She was no sooner in possession of it than hurrying to the little copse, that's, again, C-O-P-S-E, it's a small stand of trees. It is not the South Boston pronunciation of the word for a dead body. It is copse. Where she was least likely to be interrupted, she sat down on one of the benches and prepared to be happy, for the length of the letter convinced her that it did not contain a denial. The short letter would be her aunt writing to her and saying, Lydia is making things up. Miss Darcy wasn't there. I don't know what she's talking about. But no, there's obviously something to explain here. And this is dated from Gracechurch Street. My dear niece, I have just received your letter and shall devote this whole morning to answering it, as I foresee that a little writing will not comprise what I have to tell you. I must confess myself surprised by your application. I did not expect it from you. Don't think me angry, however, for I only mean to let you know that I had not imagined such inquiries to be necessary on your side. She keeps hinting at the fact that Elizabeth should know all about this, that there's more to her associations with everybody involved than she's been letting on. She's a very suspicious, playfully suspicious woman, is Mrs. Gardiner. If you do not choose to understand me, forgive my impertinence. Your uncle is as much surprised as I am, and nothing but the belief of a party being concerned would allow him to act as he has done. But if you are really innocent and ignorant, I must be more explicit. On the very day of my coming home from Longbourn, your uncle had a most unexpected visitor. Mr. Darcy called, and was shut up with him for several hours. It was all over before I arrived, so my curiosity was not so dreadfully racked as yours seems to have been. He came to tell Mr. Gardiner that he had found out where your sister and Wickham were, and that he had seen and talked to both of them, Wickham repeatedly, Lydia once. From what I can collect, he left Derbyshire only one day after ourselves, and came to town with the resolution of hunting them. The motive professed was his conviction of it being owing to himself that Wickham's worthlessness had not been so well known as to make it impossible for any young woman of character to love or confide in him. The explanation that Darcy gives them is that he feels responsible because when he was in Meryton he had told people what Wickham was really like, instead of what he could clearly see Wickham was portraying himself to be, maybe people's guards would have been up. Not sure that would have mattered with Lydia, but that is his reason anyway, the one he gives. He generously imputed the whole of his mistaken pride, and confessed that he had before thought it beneath him to lay his private actions open to the world. His character was to speak for itself. He called it, therefore, his duty to step forward and endeavor to remedy an evil which had been brought on by himself. If he had another motive, I am sure it would never disgrace him. I think she knows a hawk from a handsaw. I think she knows what's going on. He had been some days in town before he was able to discover them, but he had something to direct his search, which was more than we had, and the consciousness of this, which was another reason for his resolving to follow us. There is a lady, it seems, a Mrs. Young. We know her. Mrs. Gardiner doesn't. We do. Who was some time ago governess to Miss Darcy, and was dismissed from her charge on some cause of disapprobation, though he did not say what. She then took a large house in Edward Street and has since maintained herself by letting lodgings. This Mrs. Young was, he knew, intimately acquainted with Wickham. Yes, indeed. And he went to her for intelligence of him as soon as he got to town. But it was 2 or 3 days before he could get from her what he wanted. She would not betray her trust, I suppose, without bribery and corruption, for she really did know where her friend was to be found. Wickham indeed had gone to her, and on their first arrival in London, and had she been able to receive them into her house, they would have taken up their abode with her. At length, however, our kind friend procured the wished-for direction. They were in Donahue Street. He saw Wickham, and afterwards insisted on seeing Lydia. His first object with her, he acknowledged, had been to persuade her to quit her present disgraceful situation and return to her friends as soon as they could be prevailed upon to receive her, offering his assistance as far as it would go. So the only thing he really wants to say to Lydia is, pack your bags. I'm not looking to understand the situation, I'm looking to break it into pieces. But he found Lydia absolutely resolved on remaining where she was. She cared for none of her friends, and she wanted none of his help. She would not hear of leaving Wickham. She was sure they would be married some time or other, and it did not much signify when. Since such were her feelings, it only remained, he thought, to secure and expedite a marriage, which, in his very first conversation with Wickham, he easily learnt had never been his design. He confessed himself obliged to leave the regiment on account of some debts of honour which were very pressing, and scrupled not to lay all the ill consequences of Lydia's flight on her own folly alone. He meant to resign his commission immediately, and as for his future situation, he would conjecture very little about it. He must go somewhere, but he did not know where, and he knew he should have nothing to live on. Mr. Darcy asked him why he had not married your sister at once. Though Mr. Bennet was not imagined to be very rich, he would have been able to do something for him, and his situation must have been benefited by marriage. But he found, in reply to this question, that Wickham still cherished the hope of more effectually making his fortune by marriage in some other country. In other words, he thinks he can do better than a penniless girl, virtually penniless girl. But when you're a sponge, when you're a parasite, any host will do. You can't live on your own. Under such circumstances, however, he was not likely to be proof against the temptation of immediate relief. They met several times, for there was much to be discussed. Wickham, of course, wanted more than he could get, but at length was reduced to be reasonable. Everything had been settled between them. Mr. Darcy's next step was to make your uncle acquainted with it, and he first called in Greystoke Street the evening before I came home. But Mr. Gardiner could not be seen, and Mr. Darcy found on further inquiry that your father was still with him, and would quit the town the next morning. He did not judge your father to be a person whom he could so properly consult as your uncle, and therefore readily postponed seeing him till after the departure of the former. Again, I won't harp on it, but even Darcy recognizes how utterly ill-equipped Mr. Bennet is for anything. Imagine that he makes the decision that the girl's own father is not the person he should be talking to about. He did not leave his name until next day, and it was known only that a gentleman had called on business. On Saturday he came again. Your father was gone, your uncle at home, and, as I said before, they had a great deal to talk together. They met again on Sunday, and then I saw him too. It was not all settled before Monday. As soon as it was, the express was sent off to Longbourn. So, there was stuff that Mr. Gardiner was not saying. But our visitor was very obstinate. I fancy, Lizzie, that obstinacy is the real defect of his character after all. He has been accused of many faults at different times, but this is the true one. Nothing was to be done that he did not do himself, though I am sure, and I do not speak it to be thanked, therefore say nothing about it, your uncle would most readily have settled the whole. They battled it together for a long time, which was more than either the gentleman or the lady concerned in it deserved. But at last your uncle was forced to yield, and instead of being allowed to be of use to his niece, was forced to put up with only getting the probable credit of it, which went sorely against the grain. I really believe your letter this morning gave him great pleasure, because it required an explanation that would rob him of his borrowed feathers and give the praise where it was due. Gotta like Mr. Gardiner. He knows that, as he did in his letter to Longbourn, he knew that he was going to get the credit for laying out all the money to make this thing work, to make this problem go away, when actually it wasn't. He wasn't allowed to. Darcy laid out all the money. Darcy has 1,000 times the money to lay out, but no connection to the family other than this imagined guilt over Wickham. But he insists. He overrides Mr. Gardiner and insists. And also insists that no word be said about it, obviously, because Mr. Gardiner writes a letter and just says the arrangements have been made. and leaves the people at Longbourn to infer that he's the one doing the paying. But Lizzie, this must go no farther than yourself, or Jane at the most. You know pretty well, I suppose, what has been done for the young people. His debts are to be paid, amounting, I believe, to considerably more than £1,000. As another £1,000 in addition to her own settled on her, and his commission purchased. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's wiping the slate clean and giving them something to live on. The reason why all this was to be done by him alone was such as I have given above. It was owing to him, to his reserve and want of proper consideration, that Wickham's character had been so misunderstood, and consequently that he had been received and noticed as he was. I think he would have been noticed anyway, the way he fills out that uniform. Perhaps there was some truth in this, though I doubt whether his reserve, or anybody's reserve, can be answerable for the event. But in spite of all the fine talking, my dear Lizzie, you may rest perfectly assured that your uncle would never have yielded if he had not given him credit for another interest in the affair. Darcy's probably not the greatest actor in the world. It doesn't take much. Probably Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner realize why he is so urgently involving himself here, and it's not really that he could have blackened Wickham's character back in Meryton. There might be something else going on here. Well, all this was resolved on, and he returned again to his friends, who were still staying at Pemberley. But it was agreed that he should be in London once more when the wedding took place, and all money matters were then to receive the last finish. I believe I have now told you everything. It is a relation which you will tell me is to give you great surprise. I hope at least it will not afford you any displeasure. Lydia came to us, and Wickham had constant admission to the house. He was exactly what he had been when I knew him in Hertfordshire, but I would not tell you how little I was satisfied with her behavior while she stayed with us, if I had not perceived by Jane's letter last Wednesday that her conduct on coming home was exactly of a piece with it, and therefore what I tell you now can give you no fresh pain. I talked to her repeatedly in the most serious manner, representing to her all the wickedness of what she had done, and all the unhappiness that she had brought on her family. If she heard me, it was by good luck, for I am sure she did not listen. I was sometimes quite provoked, but then I recollected my dear Elizabeth and Jane, and for their sakes had patience with her. Mr. Darcy was punctual in his return, and as Lydia informed you, attended the wedding. He dined with us the next day, and was to leave town again on Wednesday or Thursday. You will be very angry with me, my dear Lizzie, if I take this opportunity of saying what I was never bold enough to say before, how much I like him. His behavior to us has in every respect been as pleasing as when we were in Derbyshire. His understanding and opinions all please me, and he wants nothing but a little liveliness, and for that, if he marry prudently, his wife may teach him. I thought him very sly. He hardly ever mentioned your name. But slyness seems the fashion. Little dig at Elizabeth. Pray forgive me if I have been presuming, or at least do not punish me far, as to exclude me from P being Pemberley. I like this woman. Of course I do. I think there's a lot more to her than the book gives us. But she's saying, don't be offended with me, and if you are offended with me, at least don't go so far as to exclude me from Pemberley when you're the mistress of the place. It couldn't be any clearer. It's so teasing. I shall never be quite happy till I have been all around the park. A low phaeton with a nice pair of ponies would be the very thing. But I must write no more. The children have been wanting me this half hour. Yours sincerely, M. Gardiner. So that's the letter. We now have an explanation. Darcy has been helping all along. In fact, he's been crucial, and has footed the entire bill, over the objections of Elizabeth's uncle. The contents of this letter threw Elizabeth into a flutter of spirits, in which it was difficult to determine whether pleasure or pain bore the greatest share. The vague and unsettled suspicions which had certainly had produced of what Mr. Darcy might have been doing to forward his sister's match, which she had feared to encourage, as an exertion of goodness too great to be probable, and at the same time dreaded to be just from the pain of obligation, were proved beyond this greatest extent to be true. Every once in a while, Jane Austen, our beloved author, lets her love of Walter Scott get the best of her. There should be no sentences like that in this book, but we'll push on. He had followed them on purposely to town. He had taken on himself all the trouble and mortification attendant on such a research, in which supplication had been necessary to a woman whom he must abominate and despise, and where he was reduced to frequently meet, reason with, persuade, and finally bribe the man whom who he always wished to avoid, and whose very name it was a punishment for him to pronounce. He had done all this for a girl whom he could neither regard nor esteem. Her heart did not whisper that he had done it for her. But he did do it for you. If you were analyzing anyone else in the world, you would be able to see through it, not your own heart. But it was a hope shortly checked by other considerations, and she soon felt that even her vanity was insufficient when required to depend on his affection for her, for a woman who had already refused him as able to overcome a sentiment so natural as abhorrence against relationship with Wickham. Brother-in-law of Wickham. Every kind of pride must revolt from the connection. He had to be sure done much. She was ashamed to think how much, but he had given a reason for his interference which asked no extraordinary stretch of belief. It does ask an extraordinary stretch of belief. He wouldn't go to this much bother. If he weren't personally involved, he wouldn't go to this much bother. It was reasonable that he should feel he had been wrong. He had liberality, and he had the means of exercising it. Though she would not place herself as his principal inducement, she could perhaps believe the remaining partiality for her might assist his endeavors in a cause which her peace of mind must be materially concerned. It was painful, exceedingly painful, to know that they were under obligations to a person who could never receive a return. They owed the restoration of Lydia, her character, everything, to him. Oh, how heartily did she grieve once every other ungracious sensation she had ever encouraged, every saucy speech she had ever directed towards him. For herself, she was humbled, but she was proud of him, proud that in a cause of compassion and honor he had been able to get the better of himself. She read over her aunt's commendation of him again and again. It was hardly enough, but it pleased her. She was even sensible of some pleasure, though mixed with regret, on finding how steadfastly she and her uncle had been persuaded that affection and confidence subsisted between Mr. Darcy and herself. It's pretty easy to tell. It's pretty easy to tell. You don't even need words. Just how they looked when they looked at each other at Pemberley would have been enough. Jane Austen doesn't bother to describe that moment, but you can imagine what it was like. And if you don't want to imagine what it was like, just check a Pride and Prejudice adaptation of any kind. You don't think anyone adapting this to a visual medium is going to leave out that moment. No. She was roused from her seat and her reflections by someone's approach. And before she could strike into another path, she was overtaken by Wickham, who was come to find her. And if this were a Fielding novel, he'd been come to do a lot more than just find her. I'm afraid I interrupt your solitary ramble, my dear sister, said he as he joined her, because he can call her sister now. He's married to her sister. You certainly do, she replied with a smile, but it does not follow that the interruption must be unwelcome. I should be sorry indeed if it were. We were always good friends, and now we are better. True. Are the others coming out? I do not know. Mrs. Bennet and Lydia are gone into the carriage to Meryton, and so, my dear sister, I hate this guy, I find from our uncle and aunt that you have actually seen Pemberley. She replied in the affirmative. I almost envy you the pleasure, and yet I believe it would be too much for me, or else I could take it in my view to Newcastle. It's on his way, as he goes to join the army. And you saw the old housekeeper, I suppose? Poor Reynolds. She was always very fond of me, but of course she did not mention my name to you. Yes, she did. And what did she say? That you were gone into the army, and she was afraid had not turned out well. At such a distance as that, you know, things are strangely misrepresented. Got to picture the dripping sarcasm here. You just got to. There's no way that the scene reads without it. Certainly, he replied, biting his lips. Elizabeth hoped she had silenced him, but he soon afterwards said, I was surprised to see Darcy in town last month. We passed each other several times. I wonder what he can be doing there. Perhaps preparing for his marriage to Mr. Bird, said Elizabeth. It must be something particular to take him there at this time of year. Undoubtedly. Did you see him while you were at Lambton? I thought I understood from the Gardiners that you had. He's been asking lots of questions, hasn't he? Yes, he introduced me to his sister. And did you like her? Very much. I have heard, indeed, that she is uncommonly improved within the last year or two. When I last saw her, she was not very promising. I'm very glad you liked her. I hope she will turn out well. He's got to save face here. He's vilified Mr. Bird. He's vilified Miss Darcy to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth has now seen her. So all he can do is say, well, she's probably gotten better since I saw her. I dare say she will. She has got over the most trying age. Did you go by the village of Kimpton? I do not recollect that we did. I mention it because it is the living which I ought to have had. A most delightful place, excellent parsonage house. It would have suited me in every respect. How would you have liked making sermons? Exceedingly well. I should have considered it as part of my duty, and the exertion should have been as nothing. One ought not to repine, but to be sure it would have been such a thing for me. The quiet, the retirement of such a life would have answered all my ideas of happiness, but it was not to be. Did you hear Darcy mention the circumstances when you were in Kent? I have heard, from authority, which I thought as good, that it was left to you conditionally only, at the will of the present patron. She's pretty much telling him, I know that everything you told me was a lie. You have. Yes, there was something in that. I told you so from the first, you may remember. You did nothing of the kind. You implied everything the opposite. I did hear, too, that there was a time when sermon-making was not so palatable to you, as it seems to be at present. That you actually declared your resolution of never taking orders, that the business had been compromised accordingly. You did, and it was not wholly without foundation. You may remember that I told you that on last point when we first talked of it. No, you don't remember that. You implied exactly the opposite. That you were robbed of this position when, in fact, you refused it. Anyway, they were now almost at the door of the house, for she had walked fast to get rid of him. And unwilling, for her sister's sake, to provoke him, she only said in reply, with good-humoured smile, Come, Mr. Wickham, we are brother and sister, you know. Do not let us quarrel about the past. In future, I hope we shall be always of one mind. She held out her hand. He kissed it with affectionate gallantry, though he had hardly knew how to look, and they entered the house. He hardly knew how to look because she has told him, in all but explicit terms, that she knows that everything he said about himself and Darcy was a lie. And she has it from good authority, in other words, Darcy's authority, what the truth is. She sees right through him. Doesn't like him, doesn't want his company, and is willing only for surface-level courtesy. No wonder he doesn't know where to look. But that is where we land now. We now know the story. Darcy is directly involved in all of this. And we are racketing towards the end of this book. We will continue next time. Thank you, BookTube.